And we are live.
Good afternoon. I'm Richard King, and I'd like to welcome you to the Jewish Public Library sponsored spring keynote event, which is actually taking place in the summer, a conversation with Norman Lebrecht. I'm in Montreal, and Norman is joining us from London. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Roxana Bronze, Leo Huberman, and Maria Racina of the Jewish Public Library for making this event possible. It was originally scheduled as an in-person event to take place at the JPL on the 1st of April of this year. COVID-19 changed those plans as it changed the plans of so many others. It's great that we have the technology to allow us to hold the event in virtual space, if not in real space. Norman Lebrecht was born in London and educated in Israel at the Kol Torah Rabbinical College and Bar Ilan University. He worked as a journalist for the Israeli Broadcasting Authority, and back home in London, he worked at one time or another for every major British newspaper, starting with the Sunday Times. He is the author of 12 books, and I would consume too much of our time together if I were to mention them all. He has written extensively on Gustav Mahler, and his novel, The Song of Names, was made into a film starring Tim Roth and Clive Owen. His most recent book is Genius and Anxiety: How Jews Changed the World, 1847 to 1947. He writes history in a style that draws the reader into the story, actually stories, as he recounts this history of Jewish accomplishments through the lives of the people who made them. I should add at this point, and I'll hold up a copy of the book, that the book is available wherever you buy books, and in Montreal at Paragraph Bookstore. They can be reached by phone at 514-845-5811 or by email at paragraphbooks@paragraphbooks.com. To begin, I'd like to start by asking Norman what motivated him to take on such a challenging topic for one book, as each of the chapters could easily have been a book in themselves.
Richard, thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm thrilled to be with you. I wish I was with you in person. I've been so looking forward to come to Montreal until this coronavirus disrupted all of our plans. When I reached 60, I sort of made a private resolution that I was only going to write books from now on that I'd been thinking about for half of my life. Questions that I'd had for a very long time, and that I now was in a position to have sufficient material, information, or at least avenues of research that I could possibly achieve some kind of resolution. And the question here was very simple. Between the middle of the 19th century and the middle of the 20th century, there are about 36 individuals who changed the way we see the world. Half of them are Jews. How is that possible? Jews are 0.02% of world population. How is it possible that they constitute half of the iconoclasts, half of the breakers of convention within the most inventive and transformational period in human history? There is no obvious answer for this. The answers that I'd been given or suggested over the course of the years were, well, the Jews have been let out of the ghetto, and so they were exploding with energy, and the energy all came forth at this time. Well, that's historically invalid. Jews were let out of the ghetto 2 generations beforehand, when Napoleon rampaged across Europe. So it's not the ones who were let out of the ghetto. It's not even their children. It may not even be their grandchildren. It's a long time afterwards. So the cork out of bottle theory doesn't work. Next, well, Jews are in some way or other special. They're chosen. It's their DNA. It's the exceptionalism argument. And that doesn't stack up either, because the majority of the people that I'm writing about, both the ones who are extremely well known, Marx, Freud, Kafka, Einstein, and a lot of those whom I've sort of dragged kicking and screaming out of obscurity, so that we become aware of the ways in which they affect our lives every single day. They are only from a fairly limited geographical stratum of the Jewish diaspora. They're, on the whole, very few of them are from Russia. Very few of them are from England or the United States. And hardly any of them, about 2 or 3 exceptions, are from the Maghreb or the great crescent of Jewish settlement across the Arab world. So if it was Jewish DNA, if it was Jewish exceptionalism, you would have expected a sort of universal spread, but there isn't there. It's quite a narrow thing. So why Jews? Why here? Why now? Why this period? What is it? Are there things that connect them? Is there, if you like, a formula? Is there a spark by which they can see one another, understand one another, spark off one another, and create all of these revolutions, which are intellectual revolutions, social revolutions, scientific revolutions? Let me just talk about 2 particularly close friends, because it's a relationship that hasn't been explored before. It's the relationship between Albert Einstein and Fritz Haber. Einstein we all know about, we think, as the man who created theory of relativity, redefined the relation of time and space, did more to reshape the world than anyone since Isaac Newton, and gave us indirectly the possibility to destroy ourselves. Fritz Haber, and Einstein is of course the great pacifist, the man who wanted to put the atomic bomb in everybody's hands, so that way we would have a balance of mutual disaster and we wouldn't blow ourselves up. His closest friend, the only man who ever saw Einstein cry, was a German scientist called Fritz Haber. Fritz Haber, on the one hand, is a war criminal, invented mustard gas in the First World War. He was very, very lucky to stay out of jail. On the other hand, he is the man who initiated what is known as the Haber-Bosch formula, by which nitrogen can be extracted from air, which enables us to create fertilizer, which enables us to feed the world population. If it hadn't been for Fritz Haber, we probably wouldn't be alive now because we'd be starving. So it's people like that that I'm looking at, and I'm constantly asking the question, is there something, other than the fact that they're being Jewish, is there something that bonds them, that has enabled them to participate in this program of changing the world? Sorry, very, very long answer.
Well, no, it's suggestive. I've had a chance to start poking my nose into Robert Alter's new translation of the Jewish Bible, and one of the questions that it suggested to me, and your book suggested, I happen to be reading them at roughly the same time, is there a spark, something within the religion that, if properly nurtured, and it won't be nurtured everywhere and it won't be nurtured equally at all points in history, is there something there that sort of encourages thinking in a unique way, what we call outside the box? In America, Jews created a film industry out of nothing. There was no movie industry, and suddenly there it was. And the heads of studios, the storytellers, were all Jewish. So my question is there something lying within the religion? And I have to ask someone who studied in a rabbinical college. There's no one else who could possibly answer that question.
I don't think it's within the religion. It's within something much broader, which it's within ancestral languages, and it's within the culture. And it's what I would describe in Freudian terms as a collective cultural unconscious. There is something that goes back, not in our physical DNA, but in our intellectual DNA, that enables us to think in certain ways. I'll give you sort of just 2 little examples. I mean, one personal, my late father-in-law used to say, if my wife didn't call him for a few days, he would say, "What happened? Your finger fell off that you couldn't dial?" And it was an expression so familiar to me that I knew where it came from. It comes from Exodus, where Moses says to the people of Israel, "What's the matter with you? There weren't enough graves for you in Egypt." It's a kind of Jewish rhetoric. It's an ironic perversity that runs through us. Now, if we have these linguistic affinities that run from the Bible onwards and certainly run through the Mishnah and the Talmud, then maybe that goes something towards our understanding of how these people may function. And let me give you another example. It's much more recent. Ever since the dawn of time, men and women have been trying to have sex without having babies. And they really haven't been very successful at it. There were all sorts of methods that were contrived, and usually, very often, the results were the opposite of what they intended, and uncomfortable as well. Around the 1930s, 4 guys started asking the same question. 3 of them were Jews, and the 4th was not Jewish, and he went off to Mexico, and he came back with a giant yam. And he was looking at the chemical, biological side of things, and the yam was essential in achieving what became the contraceptive pill. The other 3 were all with slight variations, asking exactly the same question. They didn't know each other until quite late in the process. The question they were asking was this. As I said, from the dawn of time, men and women were asking, how can we have sex without having babies? And what these 3 men did is they reversed the question. And they said, in what condition does a woman have to be in order not to get pregnant? Got an answer to that, Richard?
No, that's why the silence explains my waiting for you to answer it.
And what they give is a perfect Talmudic answer. And the answer actually does exist in the Talmud. The answer is, for a woman not to get pregnant, first, if she's pregnant already, she can't get pregnant. So for a woman not to get pregnant by having sex, she has to be pregnant already. Okay. From there to the invention of the pill is intellectually a millimeter, okay? All they have to do, and this is all the 3 scientists started working on, all you have to do is to simulate a state of pregnancy in the woman's body, and then the likelihood is she's not going to be fertilized because the body thinks it's pregnant. Now, that kind of reverse questioning, that kind of almost perverse questioning is extremely Talmudic. If you take almost any page in the Talmud, you will find people arguing in that sort of way. You want another example? I'll give you another example. When did it become safe to have blood transfusions? It's a question that I've asked many live audiences. Do you want to hazard? You've read the book, Richard, so you know. But when I ask live audiences, what I get is people hazarding a guess of anywhere between 1830 and 1930. And they're both way out. The idea that there are different blood groups did not dawn until the year 1900. And the man who brought it into being was then practically howled out of all of the scientific associations in Germany, because everybody said to him, you're talking rubbish. Blood is blood is blood. If it's red, it's blood. If it's not, it's not blood. That's all you need to know. Now, this man, he's one of the forgotten ones. This man is called Karl Landsteiner. He is a Viennese Jew of quite extreme alienated proclivities. And I use the word alienated in both senses of the word. He's gone a long, long way from Judaism. In fact, his mother has arranged for them both to be baptized when he goes to university so that he could improve his career prospects in Austria. And he's also, I suspect he's a little bit somewhere on the A spectrum. He's alienated from other people. He's not a sociable individual. And the work that he's doing as a scientist at the University of Vienna is working on a cure for meningitis. This is the late 1890s. They were working on a cure for meningitis then. We're still working on it now. It was a dead end, but a lot of people were working at it. One day he asked himself the same sort of question that I'm asking you here. Vienna was the world center for major abdominal surgery. If you were an American or a Canadian or an English or a French person who wanted to specialize in major surgery, you would probably go to Vienna to finish off your training. It was said in Vienna that in order for a surgeon to get a procedure named after him, he had to kill 1,000 patients. I think the quote may be ascribed to a man called Theodor Billroth, who was the best friend of the composer Brahms. But they had got the act of surgery pretty much down to a fine tee. They knew what they were doing when they opened up the body and they were looking around the organs and they were taking them out or they were cutting them up or what have you. Surgery was down to a fine art by the end of the 19th century. However, 1 in 2 patients died after surgery and nobody knew why. It wasn't to do with post-operative infection. They didn't have the kind of levels of post-operative infection then that we have today, probably because they had much larger wards and there was less risk of cross-patient infection. Landsteiner is the first to ask, Landsteiner the loner, is the first to ask, what if it's the blood? We give them blood transfusions. What if they're rejecting the blood? And that's causing some kind of post-operative shock that kills them. And people say, just go back to your meningitis, you're out of your field. But he doesn't. He goes back to his laboratory and he goes around all of his colleagues and he says, can you give me a sample of blood? And he takes the blood and he puts it under the most powerful microscope in the University of Vienna. And what do you know? Within an hour, he's found 3 different blood types. And he calls them A, B, and C. And then one of his colleagues says, it's a little bit too literal. Call them A, B, and O. He calls them A, B, and O. He then goes and delivers a paper in 1900 to the annual convention of German scientists and physicians. And they deride him, they howl him down, they threaten him with proceedings, they just say, get out of here. And so he goes back home and he writes up his findings and he goes back to try to find a cure for meningitis. 6 years later, 1906, there's a young surgeon, young Jewish surgeon at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, and he's got his first big case. He's 26 years old, he's got a patient, and he doesn't want to lose a patient. And he knows that there's going to be a certain amount of blood that will be needed in the course of the operation. And he's read about the Landsteiner procedure, the discredited Landsteiner procedure. And so he says to his surgical team, could everybody please donate a pint of blood in case I need it? We'll test it. And could everybody give me a sample of blood? Those that have the same blood type as the patient, I may need them to donate some, okay? He does that. They find the same blood type. The patient receives the transfusion. The patient survives. The surgeon is a success. Everybody lives happily ever after. From that day in 1906, we have all been able to approach major surgery with a reasonable supposition of survival. Where does Landsteiner get this from? Where does he get the idea, contrary to everybody else's thinking, where does he get the idea that blood is not blood, that there are multiple types of blood? Well, I can point out to you a number of references, quite a lot of references in the Talmud, which tell you that the blood of this animal is different from the blood of that animal. The blood of the head is different from the blood of the abdomen. This is ancient wisdom, and it's certainly not science. But there is a line of thinking going through these ancient rabbis in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th century that there is a consensus at that point. And at every other point when people continue to study the Talmud, there's a consensus at that point the blood is not uniform. There is a possibility of there being more than one form of blood. Does Landsteiner know this? No. Has he ever studied the Talmud? No. He's alienated from Judaism. Where does it come from? And this is where I would put forward my hypothesis of the collective cultural unconscious. He doesn't know it. His father may have known it. His grandfather would probably have known it. It's there in the intellectual bloodstream. He has been conditioned to think of blood as not being uniform. And when the point comes, that gives him the great idea. That enables him to break through. That enables us, you and me, Richard, everybody else is watching. It's enabled us to be alive today. Wouldn't be alive without Einstein.
No, I mean, we all know our blood type. That's either because we've donated blood or we've been through the doctor. It's just something we take for granted at this point, which raises another question, which is when these discoveries are made, and at first the discoverer is ostracized because of this sort of wealth of wrong knowledge that has preceded him. How do the barriers get broken, especially during this period you're writing about? The latter part of that period is the most anti-Semitic period following Luther's 95 Theses, probably in recorded history. But somehow the ideas become mainstream ideas, maybe in spite of the anti-Semitism, which was so prevalent between the wars and obviously during the Second World War.
There's always resistance to new ideas. It's a natural human response to something that overturns your grasp of reality. You don't like it. You don't want to know about it. I mean, when Einstein put forward his theory of relativity, when he wrote those 3 miraculous papers in the spring of 1905, the few people that took notice of him only to ignore him. Because firstly, this is ridiculous. A man who's working in a patent office in Switzerland is not going to know more than all the great physicists in the world, and is not going to be challenging Isaac Newton as to what makes the world revolve. He doesn't become a professor. He doesn't get a proper job for 7 years afterwards, until Fritz Haber, whom I mentioned earlier, plucks him out of Bern and takes him to Berlin and arranges for him to get a job in an institute. So at least there's a salary that he can pull down and bring home. He doesn't get the first of his hypotheses proven until a British scientist who's been to Antarctica and has seen the way that time curves came back and endorsed Einstein's hypothesis. It's 1919 before he gets that endorsement and he gets the Nobel Prize. And it's 2019 before the second theory of hypothesis is actually proven in the what's that called, that giant transponder in Switzerland. So it takes time for these things to bed in. But let's see, where did Einstein get these ideas? Where did these ideas come from? I'm not going to attempt to understand Einstein. Nobody understands Einstein. It's an absolute miracle what happened to him in 1905. He couldn't explain it, and he didn't try to explain it. He just had this blaze of light. But there are 2 things about Einstein that are useful to know in order to see where he comes from. Firstly, he had a knowledge of the Jewish religion. At the age of about 11, he suddenly became very religious and demanded that his parents kept a kosher home and kept the Sabbath. It lasted about 6 months. After that, he never bothered anymore. But, as an 11-year-old, something turned him onto it, and he knew the stuff. He knew it inside out. Within that, he also became fixated on the Psalms. He adored the Psalms. If ever you saw Einstein walking down the street and his lips are moving, he's probably reciting a psalm, because the Psalms create order in his universe. The Psalms are his way of explaining his relationship to the divine and to the universe as a whole. So he has this conscious awareness of Psalmic literature that forms so much of Jewish thinking. In the other respect, in respect of the greatest revolution, which is the revolution that time is relative, that time is not absolute, that a minute is not 60 seconds, that that time veers according to where you are in the world, that it's different when you're in Montreal and I'm in London. There is a concept of the flexibility of time that goes back to the very foundations of Jewish thinking in the Hebrew language. The Hebrew language in its classical form does not have tenses. It exists in a present continuous. If you read the Bible in Hebrew and not in one of the various Greek or Christian translations, what you read is a continuous a narrative in the present sense, which incidentally is one of the reasons why I wrote Genius and Anxiety in the present continuous. It's not easy to write in the present continuous. It's much easier as a historian to say this happened in the past. But I made a conscious decision that I was going to do that here. In the King James's version, the first verse of Genesis is, "In the beginning God created heaven and earth," past tense. In classical Hebrew and in the traditional rabbinic exposition of the opening verse of the Torah, the translation would run, and I think Apter does this very well in his translation. In the beginning of God's creation of heaven and earth, there is, what does Apter call it? Waste and the vagueness all around, and God said this, and God said this, and God says that. It's a present continuous. It's an ongoing process. We don't have to know what happened before in the beginning, because the beginning itself is part of this ongoing process. And so for Einstein to see that time is not fixed, that time is not delivered in historical blocks, and that time is relative according to space and other factors in the universe, one can hypothesize, and really more than hypothesize, one can actually trace this to his very Jewish consciousness. And if anybody asked Einstein, what he was all about, and they didn't accept his original scientific formula, if a journalist came to Einstein and said, "Well, can you tell me the theory of relativity? I've got a deadline in an hour," Einstein would tell a Jewish joke.
One of my father's favorite Jewish jokes, which we don't have to tell because everybody who had a Jewish father knows the joke, or a Jewish grandfather and so on. We were talking about Alter's translation. When I read it, and I was brought up in a household that was totally not religious. My father, on the other hand, was brought up in an extremely religious household. When I read the opening lines of his translation, I thought to myself, that's really a summary of what we now call the Big Bang Theory, written by people who are trying to sort out where did we all come from. And since then, we've kind of refined that knowledge, taking God out, putting all kinds of motion in. So I take it your argument is that the seeds of virtually all knowledge, or all scientific knowledge anyway, and to my way of thinking, all entertainment knowledge, certainly all jokes, can be traced back to either the Talmud or the Torah. And this is coming from someone who was totally assimilated and only started reading it when the Alter translation came out.
The seeds of a Jewish way of thinking, not necessarily the seeds of all knowledge, but the seeds in which people of a Jewish ancestry approach the world and try to understand it, may, in a way that is different from others, in a way that rejects convention and rejects the commonly accepted rules and regulations. Yeah, that's rooted there. You were talking about Hollywood. You could talk both about movies and you could talk about popular music, because Jews invented both. There was no mass entertainment before two sets of people of Jewish origin grasped the idea that music, that America was a very large country, North America was a very large country, and people were going to need to fill that space, and they were going to need to fill that time. They were going to need distraction because they had plenty. They'd never had plenty before in their lives. Back in Europe, they'd struggled. Life was hellish and existential. But now suddenly there is the possibility of leisure, and it's not just leisure, it's mass leisure. So how do you fill that vacuum? How do you, it is almost like the creation of the universe, isn't it? You have the great void, and what do you put into it? You put in entertainment, you put in ways of distracting people, of enlivening them, of engaging them, and above all, and this is a historic Jewish impulse, which goes right back to the dawn of our civilization, above all, you educate them.
Well, that kind of raises another question that's very contemporary. The creation of music in America, from its roots that were brought from Europe and the various parts of Europe, the Scottish Irish that ended up as bluegrass and so on, is a creation of Black people and Jewish people. Somehow those two groups, which probably didn't have that much contact at the beginning, had a kind of sympathetic understanding of one another. And a lot of what I hear from Black churchmen is very Old Testament.
Yep.
You don't hear much New Testament stuff, or at least I don't.
And a lot of Psalms.
Yeah. So somehow this spark is, under certain circumstances, translatable to others, and in certain circumstances, I guess you're arguing is not.
I had a little revelation once. I was teaching at a summer school in England, and there was somebody in the next room who was teaching gospel music. So I went in there and got my bit, and she was teaching this hymn which went, "Weeping may endure for the night, joy come in the morning." And I translated that back into the Hebrew, and I knew that in the Psalms. And it is so central to our understanding of the world that whatever besets us during the day, however awful our lives may seem, we live in a universe where we have renewal. And no matter how wet your pillow is at night, you're going to get up in the morning and there's going to be some hope. There will be something that's going to get you through. And that is what we had in common with many African Americans and other minorities, particularly that minority. We had other things in common with them. We had an affinity for certain minor keys, because a lot of Jewish melodies go into the minor. And we had certain rhythmic propensities, which I discuss in the book, which I take a much broader view of elsewhere. But if you want to take a look at the mainsprings of popular music in the first 20 years of the 20th century, many of the melodies are very close to Hebrew melodies. Much of Gershwin is very close to Jewish liturgical music. An awful lot of Porgy and Bess, which is supposedly the first Black American opera, seems to me to be set in a Jewish ghetto rather than an African American one. And a lot of their melodies are familiar to me from Jewish liturgy. So Gershwin himself would say that he used a mode. This was a piece of information that I had from the conductor Michael Tilson Thomas, whose grandfather was Gershwin's best friend in Hollywood. Gershwin would drop in on his grandfather and sit down at the piano, and they would fool around. And Gershwin would say, no, 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 I'm playing this in the Freygish mode. Freygish is a particular remote key to be working in. It's a Yiddish word, which means questioning. And everything in Gershwin's approach, and quite a lot in his music, has that, it ain't necessarily so, huh? Where's the question? There's the question. And I'll take you one further, because if you take it ain't necessarily so, what you have, it ain't necessarily so, you have a response. And things that you're liable to read in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so. What is that melody? That melody is a traditional East European sing-song of studying the Talmud. You walk into any yeshiva today, you will hear something very close to it ain't necessarily so.
I wonder, most of us don't wander into yeshivas.
Never too late, Richard.
I used to live in a neighborhood that was right on the border of a large Hasidic neighborhood in Montreal, but I've moved south now, so I don't have the opportunity to sort of, wander down the street on a Saturday and hear the melodies.
I can see some of our other participants actually booking themselves in now. not that I'm in any way encouraging you to do so. All that I'm saying is there is a collective way of thinking. It is a cultural unconscious. The idea of the unconscious that Freud originates, it is his idea. The unconscious is actually a Talmudic idea. Freud draws an enormous amount from those sources. And both Jews and non-Jews who want to understand why it was that Jews made this unbelievable, beyond disproportionate contribution to human civilization in that period, need to understand where those ideas originate.
Speaking of those who made the contribution, and this may be an unfair question because I'm going to ask you to pick favorites, and no parent likes to do that, but of the all the people you wrote about, is there one who, for whatever reason, became a favorite of yours?
Oh, they're all favorites. There are about 100 favorites. How can you resist someone like Benjamin Disraeli, who overturns British politics, who allies himself with the stupid party, with the party of the landowners, never had an idea in their heads, and transforms them into liberal Democrats? It's how can you resist somebody like Emanuel Deutsch, who is an ill-paid curator at the British Museum, but he manages to persuade the greatest living novelist in the English language that her next book is going to be about the return of the Jews to their land, who is the true and only begetter of Zionism, a man who's, again, another man whose name has been erased from history. It's Emanuel Deutsch. You'll find him in the book. How can you resist the Jewish housewife, mother of 10 children, who writes to Dickens saying, Oliver Twist, your most successful book, it's anti-Semitic, change it. And who engages in the longest and most intense correspondence that Dickens has with anybody outside his own immediate circle. These are really huge characters. And there are others who, when we define genius, all right, Einstein's a genius, because nobody but a mind that operates on a plane of its own could have done what he did and seen what he saw. But there are others in the story who are perhaps those who I would say some are born to genius and others have genius thrust upon them, who in a moment of crisis acted as a genius, stepped in, saved lives, did the necessary to preserve, whether it's people and their lives or a community and its consciousness. There are so many of them. There is. I'll give one final example, because This is a man who's also been practically whitewashed from history. He's a man called Leo Kestenberg. Won't ring any bells, right?
Right.
If we think of the culture of Berlin in the Weimar era, if we think of cabaret, if we think of Kurt Weill and Bertolt Brecht, if we think of the whole ferment, the whole melting pot of Berlin, that much of which is the crucible of our own culture and our civilization today, the jazz age, everything else, all of this comes down to a quite inconspicuous civil servant who, on the day the Kaiser fled Berlin at the end of the First World War, walked into the Ministry of Culture and took control of it and said, we're defeated, we've got nothing except our culture. We are going to remake culture. We are going to find ways of attracting the best and the most inventive spirits into this city at that time. This was Leo Kestenberg. He was acting in the way, in a very familiar Jewish pattern, in the way that, if you like, the prophet Jeremiah did when, at the destruction of the temple, he led the people into the wilderness, preaching all the time that they will return, and they will return with their Torah intact. They will return with a civilization and with a culture and with hope and with faith and with the possibility to build their lives anew. That's what Leo Kestenberg did. And he just slipped through the cracks of history. So I've known a couple of people who knew him. I mean, I've been around quite a while, and I always hung around some pretty old people. So I knew people who lived in the First World War, and I knew people who lived in the 1920s who could give me actually live testimony about some of these historic figures. So I'm very glad to have been able to bring them back into the limelight in the book.
And that's why the book is worth reading. I should add that I had the opportunity to read the book while I was on vacation in Florida, and it gave me the chance not to read it in 15 minutes here, 15 minutes there. I could lie in the sun and read big chunks of it at once, and it reads better, I think, because the stories are so fascinating, to read it in that way. But can we bring it up to sort of the next century, in the post-1947 world? Do you see anybody or any groups of people that are doing what your characters have done in the previous century?
To a certain degree. I mean, I chose this time frame deliberately. I chose those 2 years deliberately. 1847, because everybody always starts history at 1848. And I just don't think 1848 is very significant. I don't think the consequences of the revolutions of 1848, as a historian, were particularly lasting. It was exciting while it was there, but then it passed. 1847 is interesting because it's the year that Mendelssohn, the first Jewish contributor to Western civilization, died. It's the year that Heine, the man who revolutionized the German language, became an invalid. It's the year that Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, and the year that Benjamin Disraeli became leader of the Conservative Party. So I mean, irresistible. 1947, irresistible for different reasons. One of them being, I didn't want to take it up to 1948 because there is within Jewish historiography an end of history aspect to 1948. The state of Israel has been founded. You don't have to worry about Jewish history anymore. It's over. We're starting again. And I don't want to get into that debate. The state of Israel is what it is. I've spent quite a few years of my life there. It's not something that's relevant to this particular story, because this is the story of human reinvention during a period of phenomenal reinvention in which the Jews played this dominant role. Does it continue? Well, yes, it continues. If you look at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st, who are the movers and shakers of the internet? Who are the inventors of the internet? Who who brought Google into being, who brought Facebook into being, who are the people who saw beyond the four walls of reality, the people who saw space beyond space in the way that Einstein saw space beyond space, who are the ones that are looking to take science into extraterrestrial realms. It's about, I don't like the term, but I don't have a better one. It's to do with thinking outside the box. And for some reason, maybe because they had these foundation texts, Jews were conditioned to rebel against the foundation text and to think beyond the rules and regulations, some of which are very specific and very strict, and to say, what if, or even if what, reverse the question, ask it differently, give a different inflection. If we had the time, I would happily spend 3 hours talking to you about how a man called Gustav Mahler introduced multiple meanings in music. Music until Mahler came along was absolutely linear. It could only convey one idea at a time. With Mahler, you have multiple choice. Where does that come from? That, of course, comes from that same wellspring that I'm describing. It also comes from irony and from this particular fund of Jewish jokes and this particular way of asking a question, of letting the voice go up.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned not starting in 1848, because for a lot of historians, you know, it's one of the many revolutions starting in 1789. But 1848 brought us what? The Second Empire of the nephew. You know, the 18th Brumaire, in the as a Jewish political philosopher would call it. In England, it didn't happen. The Chartist movement did not take to the streets. So largely, I guess, because of Disraeli or the way politics was managed. In the rest of Europe, didn't really lead to anything. You know, the 1870 was the unification of Germany and so on. So it's kind of a convenient touchstone, but not significant very much. I hadn't really thought about it until just now, when you suggested that we were better off starting our thinking about the modern in 1847. I don't really have any more questions, but that doesn't mean we have to stop talking. If you have something to add, I'm sure.
Have you got any questions coming through on chat?
Let me take a look. No, nothing on chat. Either because our conversation was so brilliant, we precluded any questions, or perhaps no one understood me.
More likely no one understood me.
I have one note, people are thinking, so you may get emails.
I think we have a question coming up on chat.
No, let's take
people are thinking, okay, all right, keep thinking.
Yeah, no, that's it. So do you have any concluding remarks that perhaps you didn't get a chance to make in the book because you thought of them after it went to press? You know, once Simon and Schuster or whoever your British publisher is gets their hands on it, that's it for you. You can have another idea, but too late.
Well, there are further editions and there are different translations, and there are all sorts of ways in which I can change things. But there's certain stories that never really end, and there's certain lines of thought that continue and that live with me. I'm thinking a lot at the moment about Rosa Luxemburg, who I don't mention in the book, or hardly mention, I mean, Rosa Luxemburg is this single Jewish woman with a single-minded idea of revolution in her head, who almost succeeds in overturning the German Republic in 1919 and is murdered by right-wing activists as a result. But the formative influences in Rosa Luxemburg are really intriguing, and I'm looking at those at the moment. She's a feminist 100 years before her time. She organizes the world upon feminist and, yes, communist principles. But she's really somebody that one needs to look at more. One of the people, maybe she's one of those that I most loved in the book. I don't know. I've always loved her verse. A poet called Else Lasker-Schüler. It's not known outside the German language. Within the German language, she is considered the foremost female poet in German in the 20th century. And she lived a rackety life. I mean, husbands, lovers, nowhere to live, sometimes in a hotel. Sometimes if she couldn't pay for her hotel room, she would sleep under the table in the cafe. Everybody knew her. She was very colorful, dressed in colorful clothes. Her language was really evocative. And she had to leave Germany for obvious reasons. She wound up by mistake in Palestine in 1939. And she died in Jerusalem in January 1945. When I first came to Jerusalem as a yeshiva student, people still talked about this mad woman in the streets of Jerusalem who said she was a great poet. What do you mean, great poet? She was. That was Else Lasker-Schüler. And I was, intrigued. I went to her grave. I read as much as I could of her. And then, not very long ago, I came across a memoir by a writer and scholar called Leah Goldberg. When I was a student at the Hebrew University, I wanted to study with Leah Goldberg because she translated world literature into Hebrew, and she was simply brilliant at it. The first time I'd been able to read Russian literature was not in English, where it always sounded clunky and perverse, but in Hebrew, because modern Hebrew has a similar syntax to Russian, was invented by Russians, it sounded incredibly natural. So she was somebody I idolized. I registered at university in order to go to her course, and I never managed to attend a lecture because she was already seriously ill and she died 3 months later. I've discovered recently that Leah Goldberg idolized Else Lasker-Schüler and would torment herself in her diaries saying, do I have to be more like her? Do I actually have to give up my flat and live a beggar's life in a cafe in order to be a real poet? So these connections, these two phenomenal women poets, those things, among the many things that made the book worthwhile for me are those stories. Also, because I know that unless you read German and you read Hebrew, you've probably never heard of them.
Well, you're absolutely right. Well, I see we have a couple of questions on the chat line. The first one is from Callum in Leicester in the UK, who wants to know, how long did it take you to write this book?
It took me about 30 years to think about it and 2.5 years to write.
I guess a sub-question is, when did you decide that now was the time to put the thoughts into a literary action?
That would have been about 2015.
But really, what motivated you to say, now is the time, I have to write it?
It was this process that I described earlier, that from the age of 60, I thought I'm only going to write about questions that I've been thinking about half my life. Yeah. And so I'd put aside one book. I'd been distracted by the filming of my novel, The Song of Names, which incidentally is a Canadian enterprise with François Girard as director and Robert Lantosh as producer, and which as a result, I think I want to become Canadian. But so I was distracted by that and by certain other things that I was doing. But around about 2015, I had this conversation with my agent, and yeah, I just knew it was right. It felt right, and it felt the right time. And it's just been, among the many satisfying things that I've done, this is pretty much among the most.
Wonderful. Another question is, why does the Jewish turn of mind prove to be so effective in communicating to non-Jewish people?
Oh, that is such a good question. Maybe because they haven't listened to so much before. Maybe because they didn't want to listen before. Maybe because they're now a little bit more intrigued because they've seen the results. I don't know. It's there are we'd be going into deep waters here. Because during centuries of oppression and marginalizations, Jews developed two forms of communication. One was external communication, the way in which they spoke to power, and power was the entire non-Jewish world. And the other was the way in which they communicated within themselves. And it's the internal communication that has produced the creativity rather than the external one, which was essentially false. Now, something must have happened in order to bridge that gap and in order for non-Jewish people to become more curious, more interested, more involved. I don't know what that is, but oh my God, I so welcome that dialogue. I mean, I have such unexpected conversations with non-Jewish friends about aspects of this book and about aspects of other parts of my writing about Jews. I know not a satisfactory answer, but the best I can give off the top.
Well, I wonder if there's something in Yiddish that forces you to make the express complex ideas in simpler terms, not to lose any of the depth of the idea, but a way of speaking, which when translated into whatever other language, makes it easy to communicate. I don't know if that's a reasonable answer.
I think there's a very short gap between the mundane and the philosophical, in which a very simple statement can suddenly become world-embracing. I'll give you a little story because it's actually one of the ways in which I define Jewish irony. So in a Polish village, a farmer wakes up one morning and finds that his chickens have been stolen. So they arrest the rabbi. They got to arrest someone, they arrest the rabbi. They take the rabbi to court. He's brought before the judge. The judge says, "Do you plead guilty or not guilty?" He shakes his head, doesn't understand. They appoint a court interpreter. The court interpreter says to him in Yiddish, "Are you guilty or not guilty?" He says, "Ich bin schuldig." "I'm guilty?" "Your Honor," he says, he's guilty. Judge says, "Ask him why he stole the chickens." "Für was hast du gegangen dahin?" "Ich hab gegangen dahin." He says, "Aus Kapolis hab ich gegangen dahin." He said, "I stole the chicken." Your Honor, he says, he stole the chicken and he stole it for ritual purposes. Exchange goes on a little bit. The policeman suddenly comes in and he's got some scraggy chickens torn into pieces, into shreds. It's clear they've been taken by a fox. Judge says to the defendant, "Well, obviously it wasn't you. You're free to go." He goes outside and all of his family and his followers are on the court steps waiting for him to be dragged out in irons and sent to Siberia. And here he is walking free. And they say to him, how did you do this? How did you get off? And he says, "Man darf kennen reden." You have to know how to talk. Okay, it's a joke, But it's not a simple joke, is it? It's not a simple joke, because does he understand what has happened to him? Does he? Of course he does. Does he understand the next dimension around of what has happened to him? Of course he does. Is he actually saying that communication is much more interesting and much more complex than we're leading to believe? And this is actually the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of a joke. Yeah, that's it.
And that brings us back to Freud, who explained Jewish jokes to a non-Jewish world.
Yes, yes.
And one final question. Do other cultures also have a unique collective unconsciousness, or are we being ethnocentric?
No, that's a tricky one. That's a tricky one. I suspect, but I have no way of proving it, that there may be something similar at play within Sunni Islam, and for different reasons. I've never encountered it among Christians. I simply, I have friends who are Anglicans, and clearly they have hymnodies that they share, and they have rituals that they share, and they have certain references, which would, send me scurrying to my book so that I can understand what it is, what the hell they're talking about. But is that a collective cultural unconscious? No, that is just a shared childhood or a shared experience. It's the unconscious that I'm looking at here. And the unconscious is the Freudian unconscious. And before that, it's the Talmudic unconscious. And I don't know all the world cultures, but I haven't seen it anywhere else.
Well, which is not to say other people haven't looked. I think Weber was looking at Protestantism to find the roots of capitalism. He was wrong. Capitalism existed in non-Protestant countries, but he was looking, is the point. And this brings us to another question. How is Jewish anxiety unique?
This is really something that I should have raised sooner. So whoever asked the question, give yourself a pat on the back and you get a free book. It's a free signed copy. What goes on in this narrative, in this story that I tried to tell, is a very delicate balance between genius and how it produces, how it functions, how it has output. And the balance is between genius and anxiety, because all of the individuals that I've described, all of them have somewhere in their mind the idea that this is not forever, that the next persecution may be around the corner, the next pogrom, the next expulsion, the next Holocaust. And this provokes them into doing things fast, often so fast that they make mistakes, terrible mistakes. I mean, most of Freud's theories are riddled with errors, but he's working fast. He's working under tremendous pressure because he's always clear that he exists under tolerance of majority society, and majority society could throw him out at any time. Einstein, equally aware. Haber, much more so. Kafka, my God, it's the driving thing. Anxiety is the driving element in Kafka. Proust, who denies it, is riddled with it. So practically all of the thinkers, all of the inventors, Gershwin, my God, Arnold Schoenberg, Gustav Mahler, any of the great creators, Modigliani, the one painter that I write about, it may be exempt, but anxiety, the production of the Jews in that time is conditioned by two things. One is this inexplicable eruption of genius, and the other is the energy that anxiety gives to produce 24/7, because if you don't produce it today, you may be dead tomorrow.
There's always the feeling that the gun is to the head, and we've got to get down to business. Well, I have to say, this has been the best hour I've spent this year. It's been a wonderful conversation. I hope that when you do make it to Montreal, we'll have an opportunity to get together so you can autograph my copy of your book, and we'll have bagels and coffee somewhere.
That'll be great. I would so love that. I understand there's also some pretty good Jewish Moroccan cuisine in Montreal. I could eat a long way in Montreal.
Yeah, no, my COVID weight has a lot to do, but let's not go there. Again, I highly recommend the book Genius and Anxiety. If you're quarantined, take advantage of it and read this book. It's available in Montreal at Paragraph Bookstore. I'll give you the phone number again, 845-5811 in the area code 514, or by email at paragraphbooks@paragraphbooks.com. It's also available, obviously, wherever you're used to buying books. Thank you very, very much for spending the time with us. And I hope we'll have a chance to reprise the conversation in person at the Jewish Public Library when all this is over. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I look forward to that very much.